é de Leiria. Ok, entendi. Que não é de Leiria, mas tem aqui uma grande afetividade a Leiria e Porto de Mós e à zona da família dele, que ele vai ter a oportunidade de falar isso ao longo da sua apresentação. Portanto, encaixa-se perfeitamente o seu contributo neste trabalho. E foi muito interessante o Paulo ter-nos dado o Paulo, que nós temos aqui dois Paulos, tu és o Paulo. Foi muito interessante e, portanto, vai ser com certeza uma forma de comemorarmos o 25 de Abril de uma forma diferente. São 9h30, eu acho que vamos começar. Portanto, vamos recording in progress. Tá, Paulo? Paulo?
Tá certo.
Sim, está recording in progress, sim.
Está recording in progress. Estás a admitir as pessoas?
Também.
Ok, pronto. Então vamos começar. Boa noite. Eu tenho muita dificuldade em tratar o Paulo por Dr. Paulo, portanto tem que ser Paulo. A doutora Inácia também.
Epá, já está aqui animado, estava aqui distraída nas minhas histórias.
Tens que ligar o microfone. E queria começar então esta sessão, que é uma comemoração diferente do que é o 25 de Abril. Uma visão intimista e muito pessoal que o Paul nos vai aqui trazer, e a outra visão da doutora Maria Inácia Rezola, que vai trazer, creio eu, uma abordagem dos mais jovens, como é que os mais jovens enfrentam hoje o 25 de Abril. A organização, eu não vou perder tempo com os vossos currículos, que são extensíssimos, quer do Paul Manuel, quer da doutora Maria Inácia Rezola, eles estão disponíveis online. Não vou aqui, correria sempre o risco de cortar um ou outro evento do vosso currículo, e portanto eu não quero fazer isso. Fica disponível online, como nós fazemos sempre, e vamos começar a nossa sessão. Como é que a vamos organizar? Como vai ser bilingue, portanto o Paul Manuel vai fazer a sua apresentação em inglês, embora ele seja falante de português, porque gosta muito de Portugal, é português, tem dupla nacionalidade e, portanto, vai fazer a sua apresentação, apesar disso, em inglês, que é a sua língua de trabalho e que é a sua língua como meio de comunicação a nível académico. E a doutora Maria Inácia Rezola, claro, em português. Para obviar alguma pergunta do nosso auditório que terá a oportunidade de o fazer, eu proponho o seguinte: vamos utilizar o bate-papo, não vamos admitir perguntas diretamente, vamos fazer através do bate-papo, para que o Paulo possa olhar para a pergunta, ter o seu tempo de preparação, pedir alguma dúvida, se assim o entender, e portanto não vamos admitir perguntas diretas. Vamos sim admitir perguntas através do bate-papo, e depois, quando estiver online, também pode continuar, este não termina aqui. Paul, não sei se acompanhaste, queres alguma indicação? Eu falei devagarinho para tu conseguires acompanhar, mas há alguma dúvida? Não? Não?
Bem, sim. Tá perfeito.
Está perfeito. Então vamos começar por ti, Paul, a tua visão e as consequências do 25 de Abril, uma reflexão pessoal da diáspora portuguesa. Paul,
Thank you so much, Ana. It's a great pleasure. Muito obrigado por vocês. And so, Inácia and I have been planning this presentation. Thought, now that it's April 25th, that we would take a different approach to the question. Instead of a dry academic presentation, we thought that it might be interesting to talk about April 20th way, which is how it impacts the family at the local level and build up, tell the story up. And I'll give a couple of reasons why we think that's a good way to approach it. But mostly when we look at historical facts, they become parts of history books, dry facts, and young people lose interest quickly. But when you can talk about something like this in a way that's meaningful to an individual, then I think it can have more resonance and people will begin to understand why it's so important to continue to talk about it. Now, before I go further, I'm going to talk just briefly. The comments that I have are based on my recent book, which would not be possible without Inácia for her great assistance in helping me secure the permissions from all the captains of the interviews that I took. And I built this around that story. But instead of just going through the details of what they told me, I'd like to talk about the backstory of what they told me. Now, to begin, a recent survey was taken by the Mario Soares Foundation, by the Gulbenkian Foundation, and a Catholic university, asking about the importance today of April 25th. And there were some very interesting results. Women continue, and those younger continue to view them as important. Freedom of expression, freedom in a general way are seen as very important. But when they ask the bigger question of how important is it to you, of the people say it's important to remember and celebrate April 25th. Only 63%. Now that's very bad news if you run a flower shop and you sell carnations, because that means 37% of the population is not buying carnations today. And so for me, the question is, why 37% don't think this is important? It's a failure of education. It's a failure of experience. It's a failure of understanding. And when I speak about that, I'm talking beyond the classroom instruction. I'm talking about the shared experience of the Portuguese in Portugal in the diaspora as an example of why this is something that we need to address. So I built this slide in my presentation for those 37%, and for the rest, I hope you enjoy it. But it's for those 37% who don't think it's important. So for me, 25th of April, e daí? The so what question, why we're talking about April 25th. And for me, it's unbelief that 37% of the population doesn't consider it important. Well, let me take a step back and put my academic hat on and talk about a theory of how this could be the theory of path dependence. And path dependence is an approach in which a society shares norms, beliefs, traditions based on perhaps a shared experience, a historical event that's unique to a political system. So in this case, April 25th is something shared by the Portuguese within Portugal and the worldwide diaspora. It's also something developed over time and in response to a shared historical event. I don't want to go into the whole details of the approach, but there are 5 basic points. It tries to explain the importance of an idea in history. It talks about history in terms of historical, institutional ways. This is not rigorous social science that you can trace hypotheses and causal events. It's an art. It's a sense of understanding what happened and how one event might have impacted another event, and how other events beyond our control could control who we are as a people today. So path dependence is a suggestive approach, but I think it's exactly what we need to understand April 25th. In the American Academy, when we talk about the path dependence approach, we frequently talk about the French, what we call the French and Indian War, which was really the 30 Years' War between the UK and France, in which they were fighting over control of the colonies. The victory of the British against the French means that this lecture right now is in English, because if the French won, it would be in French. And what does it mean? It means that when my family arrived in the United States from Portugal, English became the maternal language of the next generation. And it means that I can approach Shakespeare as a native speaker of English. That's what it means. It opens up a whole set of new cultural phenomena. It also means if I want to read Molière, I'm going to read it as an outsider. A path was chosen that had nothing to do with the choice I made, that I inherit. April 25th is the path that was made. And so the next generation of Portuguese inherit it. And understanding your inheritance is critical to being an informed, engaged, intelligent citizen. It can't be something that you say, oh, we don't have to celebrate that, or one of those things. It's very important to understand. So I'm speaking in English because of something that happened in 1763. Another example, and there are many, but I'll just stop with this one. And again, in the American Academy, we talk about 9/11. The Patriot Act and all the legislation and all the wars and everything that happened following that date were unthinkable on September 10th. The police control, the security checks at our airports, and now, of course, globally. But Americans are very proud of their independence. That goes from the beginning. We're very proud of our rugged individualism. We don't like state control. That goes from the revolution all the way through. And yet suddenly we become lovers of state control because we're so afraid of dying because of what happened on 9/11. Oh, it's understandable, but it's a new path that we didn't choose. It's a reaction to a shared trauma, which was 9/11. And now 20 years later, we're still trying to make sense of what is our relationship with the state, what is our relationship with authority, and what are we willing to risk when we get on those airplanes? How much of our personal freedom are we willing to give up for our personal safety and our physical safety? Again, conversation we're having because of a shared event. So moving on. In Portugal, it's the same. We could talk about 1933, the year in which everything begins with Hitler and Salazar, and FDR's in the corner of that visão histórica. And then, of course, April 25th. And this approach, this path dependence approach, impacts each of us as individuals, each family, each community, each nation in a unique way. And so when we begin to think of April 25th as a shared collective experience, it has more salience. It means something to individuals. It's an inheritance that we were born into. And so a way to think about it, and here's a carnation, is that choices that are made by people in authority lead to policies or assets or governance that are unique and innovative that can have consequences. So the dynamic relationship between the choices that are made by our leaders and the consequences, and those consequences are historic. So what happened in 1763 in that military battle impacted us right now. Making those connections is what path dependence does. So again, it's not a strict social science methodology. It's suggestive, but it's a useful tool to make sense of the world. We know that when Salazar became head of state, dictator, he tried to connect himself with the traditional path of Portuguese society. So here he is portrayed as the first king of Portugal, Afonso Henriques. There he is. He defends the country. He defends the nation. He's the fighter. He's the heroic leader. I don't think Afonso Henriques looked like that, but you see what he was doing. It's a fantastic example of political propaganda. And here he is. His devotion was well known. He was a discoverer. He was devoted to Our Lady of Fatima. He went to those stories because he was connecting to a Portuguese story and says, oh, forget that First Republic. They were against our path, but this is what we're about. And it brought stability. And if you were unthinking or you just really trying to attend to your family and not paying attention to it, they, oh, okay, move on, continue. And so it provided stability. It was horrific, but it provided stability. But there was a logic in connecting his fascism to a story that was bigger than him instead of a new story. It was an old story. And of course, Portugal wasn't small. It was as big as all of Europe. And every single Portuguese schoolboy and schoolgirl saw this map for many years up until April 25th. April 25th changed this. It changed a lot of this. So let me just take a step back. I'd like to speak about my own experience, which is a voice from the Portuguese diaspora. And I would be a grandson of the diaspora. It's my grandparents who had a unique experience with April 25th, and they were very unique people. So here they are. That's me in the middle, on the top, and there they are at Logan Airport. And in 1919, during the First Republic, my grandfather decided that he had enough with Portugal, and it was time. He was 19 years old. Since the age of 12, he had worked in the Minas de Valverde. That was his life every day, along with Anna's grandfather, where they became great friends. Anna and I have known each other since we were children because our grandfathers were best friends. And even when he left Portugal, he said, it's not for me, chega. And I'm not talking about a political party, just chega, time to leave. So he got on that boat and he came over, and my grandmother followed him 2 years later. My whole life, this was the path, but you see the path he took from Lisbon to Boston? Hence, I'm a professor at American University in the United States. He chose it, and that brought me here. But he never left Portugal. This was the America that he had. He ran a bar, it was an immigrant bar for Portuguese. He had some economic freedom. He had his sons, he had his wife, he had his family. It was Portugal in the United States, but he had something that he didn't have in Portugal, which was some economic independence by running a bar for Portuguese immigrants. And here's the boat. This is the boat that he took, and that's he and my grandmother and my cousin, Laura, as they were going from Boston back to Portugal. They were unique among a lot of the diaspora because they returned to Portugal every year. And having a bar allowed him to do that. Someone else took care of it, and he could go back and forth, the restaurant bar. And this is what he found. This is the Portugal of my grandparents. This is the Portugal that never changed. This is the path they were on. That man at the donkey and the accordion, that's my father. On the top left, that woman on the donkey and the man, those are my grandparents. This is the world I was born into. On the right, that's my mother with my grandparents praying at Fatima. On the top right, it's my great-grandfather, my cousins, my uncle, all in Portugal. This is their world. It was a coherent world. It was a family world. It was guided by certain basic principles in which family, Fado, and Fatima controlled everything. Oh, they loved Fado. My grandfather loved his Fado, and my grandmother loved the Blessed Mother. And this is the world I was born into. This is the village in 1958, May 13th, a procession, which you see all over Portugal, but it becomes part of the story. It becomes an important fundamental aspect of Portuguese culture. It becomes who they are. It's not just a religious observance that you do because you have to. It be internalized. They're on that path. And it continues. So this is me on the left. And on the right, bottom right, I'm there with my wife. And you can see I know how to show a girl a good time because I bring her to the village. But it was important that she know my family. And that was important for me, for her to see this. This is my family. This is the Portugal of my grandparents. Unchanging. Always the same. America was a place where you had all new possibilities. But Portugal, you could always rely on it because you could go home and it was safe. Maybe you had didn't have great plumbing. Maybe, there were marshes everywhere, but it was okay. And then April 25th happened. Portugal was on a new path. The unknown was horrifying to many, including my grandmother. I was a teenager. I went to visit my grandparents. I was interested in politics. And I asked my grandmother what she thought, and she starts to cry. She was horrified. And she was praying to the Blessed Mother, and you didn't disturb her when she was saying her rosary. I said, grandmother, why? She said, God has to protect Portugal. Something bad has happened. Our Lady of Fatima warned us about this. The path was disturbed for her, and she didn't make sense of it. She didn't understand. I didn't understand what was going on. I was still a teenager. I was interested. I was fascinated. I thought it was great. Dictatorship gone, democracy, sort of these visions. I thought it was wonderful, but I didn't understand the reaction, and that puzzled me. So what? What was April 25th? So let's keep going. In a technical form, we all know it's a military coup that overthrew the 48-year-old Estado Novo regime. We know that they produced fundamental changes through the revolutionary process. We know all of that, but there's more. It impacted my family and yours in deep and profound ways. And that's the message young people have to know. For example, when I was writing my dissertation in Portugal, here is January 13th, 1991. It was a presidential day. That's the day Suarez won with overwhelming support. Mario Suarez had support of the PSD, and also, yes, you remember that election. It wasn't much of an election. Suarez easily won. But when I went to visit the village that Sunday, they blockaded it. They had a protest that was on the national news because they felt that the government had not been responding to their needs for roads and better water and better schools. It was unimaginable, unimaginable in those earlier slides. And as a political scientist, as someone may try to make sense of all of this, it got me thinking. Let me take a quick story. Summer of 1975. So my grandparents come back to Portugal, as they do every year, and they brought my parents with them. They go to Rio Maior, and they were visiting cousins. That was why they were there. And my father had a headache, and he parked the car, and he went to go to the pharmacia to buy some aspirin. He told my grandparents and my mother, "I'll be right back." And as he's walking across the town square, this is what he sees. This is Portugal? Geez. This is what he sees. He described the anger, the violence. There were guns that were captured. The police were doing nothing. He described every detail, and he was meanwhile with his tourist camera, Nikon, snapping like crazy. And as he was doing that, you see these men? They saw him. They called him out and they surrounded him. You see that fellow staring at him? They surrounded him in a circle and they threatened his life. They said, "You're a communist photojournalist. You want to share our faces with the activists to come and kill us? We're going to get you first." "Oh, no, so Portuguese. Well, if you're Portuguese, why are you here? You look funny. You look different." "No, so Americano." "Well, how could you be American?" And in the middle of that, when he was feeling that the world was coming to an end, this is the Portugal of his youth. He couldn't understand. 3 men in the crowd were cousins who said, "Eu primo Chiquinho. Oh, no, tá bem. And suddenly those 3 cousins saved my father's life. I dedicate this book to those 3 cousins. Well, April 25th was a big deal. To my grandparents, just after they were told what happened, they didn't know what happened to my father. He came back and told them, if you look at the woman, that's my grandmother, the consternation, the concern on her face was deep. It didn't go away, mind you. And my grandfather sort of puzzled. That's their friend, Manuel Santos. But they were just trying to figure out what just happened. What's happened to Portugal? This is crazy. This is my father later that day, the tall man on the left. His hair's not combed. He looks really, I'm glad he's lucky that he survived. But that was his day thinking, what happened? And this is the next day in Portimão with those 3 men, the 3 cousins that saved his life. And they wanted to have a celebration. They just thanked them, buy them, a meal. So that's the background. It's a big part of, April 25th becomes a big part of my own life and my own curiosity because I'm a political scientist. So here I am in Coimbra at the center of 25th April, and my whole question was, who did this? Why did they do this? What was the point of April 25th? And the best way to do it, I'm a social scientist, is to talk to the people who did it. Go and find them and identify them. And so the Coimbra helped me, Professor Boaventura de Sousa Santos helped me, his team helped me, Natessa Coimbra helped me, others, they put me in touch with the association in Lisbon, 25th April, who were incredibly gracious. Everyone was gracious. And suddenly there I went. And this is me with Otello, one of my most favorite meetings with him. And he was gracious and they listened to me. So I went and I listened and I learned a lot. I could tell stories about each one of these things. But there's Vasco Lorenzo on the left. He was, after we finished, he had to go pick up his children. So he drove me to the metro and he told me about his kids. There's Spieler. When I met him at the military academy, everything stopped. Everyone was saluting. I was the only one that didn't. And I got to interview a gentleman with a monocle. Never had that experience. Each of these gentlemen, Fabian on the top right, he was very interested in watching sporting that night. They had the whole time he's looking at his watch. I said, well, we can finish quickly. Each one, we had a story. Jaime Neves just kept telling me, don't worry, I took care of Portugal. Your grandparents were worried, but I took care of it for him. Just tell them everything's fine. Ianch, in the 2 hours I was with him, he had 6 picas. Costa Gomes, I met him in front of his apartment, Avenida Estados Unidos da America, and he had his groceries. I went up and brought his groceries to his apartment, and I sat around his table like I was talking to him, my grandfather. Melo Antunes, I went to Paris. I got his phone number. I think it was Alf that gave it to me, but I went, called him. How'd you get my number? I said, your colleagues gave it to you. Oh, okay. And we talked on the phone. He didn't want to meet in person. We talked on the phone. But Vasco Gonzalez, his grandson, who became an actor, was about 8 at the time, running around, sitting in his grandfather's lap, talking. I had 2 days of conversation with him. Each of them, Alf's, oh my goodness, the greatest intellectual I've ever met. Books everywhere and most fascinating conversation. Victor Crespo from Portmós. And then he finds out that his nursemaid growing up, his nanny was from Matuzure, my grandmother's village. He found out, he was at that point the archivist at the National Library in Lisbon, at the Geronimus. And so he said, I'm going to make you be proud of being a Portuguese. So we finished the interview. He brought me into the archives up through a special area that was all climate controlled. He showed me a document. He said, what do you think of it? I said, I'm not sure what it is. These are the documents that Vasco da Gama, these are his notes when he arrived in India. This is where he spilled some tea. It was unbelievable. Rosa Coutinho, Sanchez Rosario, he told me the whole time about how President Costa Gomes was a devout Catholic and a Jesuit priest who used to celebrate Mass with them all the time. I wouldn't have found that out otherwise. Each of them told me interesting stories, and of course, of all of them, Mario Tomei was the most gracious, the most kind, the only one to serve me with bika and food, and it was just, they all were extraordinary, but his graciousness is something that I'll never forget. And then, of course, Gavaldo Melo, I went out to his place in Cascais, and I told him about what happened to my father, and so he told me the story. And sure enough, one of those mochas, we have it. I grew up with it. And he told me the story of the anti-communist movement in Rio Maior. Now, Costa Gomes didn't think it was an anti-communist movement. He thought it was a setup by the right. So I got different perspectives of what happened. But whatever happened, I know my father didn't enjoy the day. And so I learned and learned and learned about it. And I learned through the process. And there's so much on all this. I've learned you're free to choose, but you're not free to choose the consequences of your decisions. And that's what happened. And each one of those individuals chose a path based on their own understanding of what was the best thing to do. But the consequences, which on balance were good, and we'll talk about that in a second, were not of their own choice. You can't identify one choice that led to a particular outcome. It's a mix, but each of them add ingredients to it. And so for me, getting to know them individually, I spent on average 2 to 3 hours with each one of them. And it's such a Portuguese experience. When they found out I was a Luso descendant, they treated me as if I was a member of their family and opened up. Now, I was interviewing them in 1990-91, so 15 years after the revolution or so. And so they were ready to talk, and they were still of relatively good health, and so people could share. So what are the consequences? Well, I want to wrap this up and turn it over to my colleague, Inácia, but let me just go through 10 briefly, and I think we can talk more about these later. These, I think, will be pretty obvious, but they're also a function of the sum total of all the choices made by those individuals who had history in their hands on April 25th. The first one, Mário Soares and Álvaro Cunhal. One understood political theater and the other didn't. Soares takes the train from Paris, the Comboio de Liberdade. He takes press conferences, he gives speeches, and the conductor waits for him to tell them it's okay to go from station to station. Poetry, beauty. The French Revolution is coming to Portugal by the Comboio de Liberdade. Cunhal was in Moscow, and he takes a plane that stopped in Paris, arrives, and a couple of party supporters were there. He missed the boat. Cunhal lost. Soares won the political theater, and of course later we'll see what that represents. And there's Soares arriving in Lisbon, and he's being greeted by Spínola. We saw a great intrigue in Portugal that was not thinkable before April 25th. Socialists, communists, radicals, agrarian reform, the TV, the long, never-ending conversations, debates between Soares and Cunhal. Even one was in French, filmed in Paris. The MFA, Povo, all that conversation, that fighting over visions of a just society, which is what the captains talked to me about. All of this happened. It's a direct consequence of April 25th. The free and fair elections that took place, the constituent elections, and then the elections that we still have. a direct consequence of that. International intrigue, the diaspora, my grandmother worrying because she got Time magazine and she saw that. Right, Brett in Portugal. Oh, meu Deus. It was terrible. I said, oh no, grandmother, it's okay. Democracy is okay. They're going to have an election. Everything's fine. But what was I? I was 15. What did I know? It was not good. But it happened. It was unleashed. And there was a lot of repressed anger and hope to make a better society that Salazar had quelled. And it needed to be expressed, and it needed to be exploded. And it needed to sort itself out. Constitution that we have, and the Constitution opened up a new path, especially between 1976 and 80, but everything has been tried. Minority, majority, one-party governments, coalition governments, presidential initiative government. Portugal has experimented. Portugal is within a framework of law, which is much more important than just the individuals. So those individuals, the choices they made led to this. Much more important than any individual. It's a law that now grounds Portuguese society. And of course, finally getting the military out of the equation was very important. That was a direct consequence of this. Joining the European Union, Portugal would not be Portugal without it, especially during the pandemic. The support from the European community was absolutely essential as Portugal could survive. And so this completely changed Portugal, and we all know that. The whole idea of coalition formation and alliance building, perhaps the best example is Jeringosa, which we didn't expect, but we saw sort of a problem-solving coalition that broke apart in the last election, but still something had happened that was unimaginable really prior. The only sort of coalition formation we had during the dictatorship was do what I say. And now, give and take negotiations is something very common. Obviously, power sharing, PS and PSD, the asymmetry that we have with maybe a 3-year interruption, we'll see, but it's something new. And something that defines Portugal that didn't happen before April 25th. And then, of course, going to my political science background, we can refer to Portugal in a minimalist way as an institutional democracy, because there have been free and fair elections since 1976, in which all adult populations have been able to participate. The elections are for every level of government, including the highest authority, and basic human and civil rights are respected. Now, obviously, there's always room for improvement. And it's not done perfect, but in a general way, it's happening, and it didn't happen before April 25th. This happened, all of this, because of April 25th. The consequences are huge. And the consequences for your individual life are huge, because you can live in Portugal, you can be economically freer, you have more independence, you can express yourself, you can feel free, or you don't have to participate if you don't want to. There are options that you have that didn't exist before. The Portugal of my grandparents has been changed, and it's a good thing. Not the love of family, that's always the best, but the idea of corporatism and the empire have been replaced by democracy in Europe. No more lusotropicalism, none of that, it's all over. And becoming completely integrated into Europe has opened up so many possibilities for Portuguese young people to travel throughout Europe, to travel throughout the world in ways that were unimaginable when I was younger. When I first went to Portugal, ninguém falava inglês. Ninguém. Era preciso falar em português com meus primos. Sem Ana. Era a única. E agora, everyone speaks English. The education system is remarkably improved from what it was, and especially at the local aldea level. 37%. It's an amazing figure. I've addressed my comments to that 37% to say, this is your story. This is who you are, and you may not know it, but the freedom you have in Portugal is because of what happened by those gentlemen. E daí, isto que é, this is my father. That's him in 1975, and that's him just when the book was published in 2020. And he took that photo, and he said, obrigado. Thank you very much.
Obrigado, Paul. Thank you very much, Paul. I was fascinating looking at your slides, and at the same time, my memory was full of memories. You know, my memory was full of memories. You know what I mean?
Of course.
So, thank you very much. Muito obrigada. E
Nada.
agora, sem mais, vamos ouvir a doutora Maria Inácia Rezola. Muito bem-vinda, muito obrigada. Eu peço desculpa por não ter ingressado logo. Eu sei que foi um dia hoje muito cansativo, mas estamos aqui disponíveis para ouvir.
Muito bem. Posso compartilhar a tela?
Sim, sim, faz favor. Eu vou então pô-la como anfitriã, certo?
Eu acho que tenho autorização. Já estão a ver, não já?
Ok, já estamos a ver, sim.
Ok. Bem, eu começo obviamente por saudar todos os presentes e agradecer muito em particular à organização e ao professor Manuel, que foi na prática quem nos pôs em contacto por este convite. Eu tive também o privilégio de ter acesso à apresentação do Manuel antecipadamente e, portanto, pude ajustar um pouco a minha própria intervenção nesse sentido e dizer desde já que não só eu não sou tão boa oradora como o Paul o é, como não tenho histórias tão entusiasmantes nem tão entusiasmadas como aquelas que ele nos contou. Eu penso que vou tentar não repetir algumas das ideias fundamentais que o Paul enunciou, mas nós, apesar do eterno debate que existe e continuará a existir sobre que tipo de regime político foi afinal o Estado Novo, é um regime totalitário, é um fascismo, é um autoritarismo, a verdade é que não existe qualquer dúvida quanto ao facto de que a repressão, a polícia política, os tribunais políticos foram peças fundamentais desse regime, que a partir de 45 e depois dos anos 60 de forma mais óbvia, ficou obviamente, claramente em desfasado da realidade mundial, um país crescentemente anacrónico. E todas as tentativas que no chamado marcelismo se encetaram para uma liberalização ou para qualquer tipo de democratização ou de reforma nesse sentido, acabaram por ser inevitavelmente inviabilizadas pela guerra colonial. Nós estamos a falar, como sabemos, de um país de analfabetos, de um país de pobres, de um país, como dizem muitos dos que viveram esses dias do que o Paulo nos falou, o 25 de Abril, eram de um país a preto e branco. Um país a preto e branco que esses mesmos relatos, como nós vimos também nas fotografias do Paulo, nos revelam depois que ganha cor. Estas imagens do 1º de maio, que serão a consagração da vitória dos capitães, vão encher o país. Um país, como o Paulo nos disse, onde a ideologia se radicalizou e entrou no cotidiano. Um país que, para muitos jovens, para quem Portugal tinha perdido 2 desafios fundamentais da história do século XX, a queda das ditaduras em 45 e o maio de 68, os tentava recuperar nesses 18 meses, ou seja, de forma compactada, nesses 18 meses que foram os da Revolução. E, portanto, muitos desses jovens que tinham vivido o maio de 68 veem Portugal como um laboratório político, onde tudo era possível, onde todas as possibilidades estavam em aberto. E foi um país, como sabemos, como o Paulo nos explicou tão bem, com diferentes opções, com diferentes vias, aprendeu e construiu a sua democracia. Se nós virmos, este é um exemplo disso, que são os materiais que foram produzidos antes das primeiras eleições livres, das eleições para a Assembleia Constituinte de 1975, eles não deixam de nos surpreender, não é? Ensinar como se votava. Não é? Portanto, todo este processo de recenseamento e de realização das primeiras eleições é muito paradigmático para algumas das opções que foram feitas e que, como o Paulo nos disse, deixaram marca até aos nossos dias, felizmente. E por tudo isto e por tudo o que o Paulo nos disse, é evidente que nós continuamos e espero que continuaremos a celebrar o 25 de Abril. E celebramos como aconteceu hoje na Avenida da Liberdade, mas também nas ruas de todo o país. Foi também assinalado este momento na Assembleia da República. E o que nós verificamos, como o Paulo também referiu, nas sucessivas sondagens que vão sendo produzidas sobre este período e a memória histórica da ditadura e da Revolução, a verdade é que genericamente, e apesar desses 37%, Paulo, a verdade é que os portugueses se dizem satisfeitos com o 25 de Abril e consideram o 25 de Abril um dos factos mais importantes da história de Portugal. isto não exclui de, apesar de a democracia continuar a ser o regime que todos apontam como sendo o preferível, existirem aqui são 15%, mas não deixam de ser preocupantes, Paulo, não é? Que dizem que, em algumas circunstâncias, um governo autoritário é preferível a um sistema democrático. Isto leva-nos a pensar, como nos diz o Pedro Magalhães, que nós somos claramente um país de democratas, mas também de descontentes e de desafetos, nomeadamente no que diz respeito à democracia e à sua qualidade. E, portanto, a pergunta, ou a afirmação, melhor, que muitos fazem de que valeu a pena a festa, leva muitas vezes um ponto de interrogação, não é? E são muitos, esses 37%, nomeadamente, não é, que se questionam se terá de facto valido a pena fazer o 25 de Abril. E parece que somos outra vez transportados para este período que o Paulo nos falou, do ano de 75, em concreto do verão quente de 75, com um país que vivia em plena Guerra Fria e que se dividiu também entre os dois blocos, o soviético e o ocidental, um país dividido pela linha do Tejo entre propostas políticas diferentes e um país à beira da Guerra Civil, sem fim à vista. E quando nós pensamos no que tem sido, porque é sobretudo sobre estas questões da memória que eu pretendo falar e serei breve, e será sobretudo nestes momentos de comemoração que nos levamos a questionar que uma das afirmações que é sucessivamente feita sobre a forma como os portugueses lidam com o seu passado, ou seja, a imagem de que Portugal é um país reconciliado com o seu passado, é questionada. E vou-vos dar apenas 4 exemplos de um levantamento muito superficial e muito sumário que fiz em 4 momentos centrais em que nós celebramos datas simbólicas do 25 de Abril, ou seja, no 10º, no 20º, no 30º e no 40º aniversário do 25 de Abril. E o que nós verificamos são contextos, eu não os vou explicar, todos os recordarão facilmente, são contextos muito diferentes, mas há uma nota, ou alguns aspectos comuns e uma nota comum em todas estas celebrações, que é sem dúvida alguma a falta de unidade. A primeira grande data de celebração do 25 de Abril, que será o 10º aniversário do 25 de Abril, foi marcado pela celebração de iniciativas autónomas, diversificadas e por vezes rivais. Não só o governo realizou as suas comemorações do 25 de Abril autonomamente da Associação 25 de Abril, como muitos outros promotores levaram a cabo iniciativas próprias. Quando passaram 20 anos sobre o 25 de Abril, é uma conjuntura muito interessante, porque é quando acaba o monopólio estatal da televisão e as televisões ganham a primazia nestas celebrações. Há a célebre polémica do cravo, que depois foi reproduzindo nas décadas seguintes, usar ou não usar cravo, nomeadamente nas cerimónias oficiais da Assembleia da República nesse dia, e depois as violentíssimas discussões e debates que existiram sobre temas como a descolonização ou a polícia política. Nos 30 anos do 25 de Abril, o slogan do governo, Evolução, lançou o mote para a polémica desse período. Evolução ou revolução, como todos recordarão, foi o tema forte deste período, foi praticamente o único debate que ocorreu nestas comemorações, marcadas também pela ausência dos capítulos de Abril das celebrações oficiais. E, finalmente, em plena crise económico-financeira, no momento em que houve um fortíssimo embate entre a então Presidente da Assembleia da República e os capitães de Abril, nós temos uma multiplicidade de organizações e, sobretudo, de eventos e de colóquios científicos que rapidamente se transformaram em meetings, em comícios políticos e na utilização da história, utilizando-se a história para atacar as políticas governamentais. Se nós analisarmos, este é o primeiro exemplo que eu vos posso dar de como é difícil ainda, apesar de tudo que o Paulo nos disse, discutir a história e a memória deste período tão recente em Portugal. E o mesmo se diz no que diz respeito à memória e à história da ditadura. E vou-vos trazer apenas 3 exemplos, vou ser muito rápida, depois se quiserem poderei explicar melhor no debate estas situações. 3 casos que nos deixam claro como nós temos ainda uma grande dificuldade em debater o nosso passado recente. O célebre programa Os Grandes Portugueses, que passou na RTP, depois, já irei recordar, a célebre polémica entre Manuel e Rui Ramos nas páginas do Jornal Público, e finalmente a longuíssima discussão em torno daquilo que foi chamado Museu Salazar, ou Centro Interpretativo do Estado Novo, etc. Muito rapidamente, sobre o primeiro evento, como todos recordam, o programa televisivo, que não era um formato inédito em Portugal, a sua origem tem, o formato é da BBC, em Inglaterra ganhou Churchill, em Espanha Juan Carlos, e portanto nomes óbvios. Em Portugal, como todos recordam, ganhou o primeiro lugar, o primeiro classificado como o grande português foi Oliveira Salazar. E esse facto foi notícia não só em Portugal, como em muitas partes do mundo. Trago aqui o caso de uma notícia del País, mas encontro as mesmas referências na imprensa de todo o mundo. Este programa obedecia, como se recordarão, a moldes muito específicos, que explicarão em grande parte os resultados. Também o facto de ter sido um brilhante intelectual e intelectual público, assumidamente de direita, a defender a figura de Salazar, terá também influenciado neste resultado. Mas o mais interessante é nós percepcionarmos o debate intensíssimo, mas também muito pouco conclusivo, que se gerou a este respeito. Eventualmente, um dos poucos lúcidos neste debate, em que muitos, como Mário Soares, desprezaram e minimizaram o impacto do que estava a acontecer, terá sido José Medeiros Ferreira, que chamou a atenção para aqueles que exigiam a inclusão do nome de Salazar na lista dos elegíveis, o que é que eles achariam se Hitler estivesse entre os elegíveis na Alemanha ou Mussolini entre os elegíveis em Itália. No que diz respeito à polémica entre Rui Ramos e Manuel, ela foi lançada, como se recordarão, no verão de 2012, o verão é sempre muito quente, nomeadamente em termos historiográficos, quando o jornal, o Expresso, o Semanário Expresso, começou a publicar em fascículos a história de Portugal, de que o Rui Ramos era um dos coordenadores. O Manuel, que era então um colunista do Jornal Público, saiu à praça pública e acusou Rui Ramos de ficcionar a história da ditadura, dizendo que a história de Portugal de Rui Ramos era, e cito, uma ficção sinistra, intelectualmente cínica sobre a ditadura de Salazar. Rui Ramos escudou-se dizendo que havia uma manipulação da sua perspectiva historiográfica, da sua interpretação historiográfica, e disse que o debate que estava a ser iniciado era um simples caso de difamação pessoal. E se tentarem recuperar estes momentos, vão ver que rapidamente, nas próximas semanas, o público se tornou o palco de um intensíssimo debate entre os apoiantes de um e do outro historiador. E houve muito poucos que conseguiram debater ou trazer à praça pública o debate do que de facto estava em causa, que era a questão: que tipo de regime foi afinal o Estado Novo salazarista? Finalmente, e só para terminar, o caso do Museu de Santa Combadão. A história não é nova, eu vou fazer uma breve alusão ao que se passou mais uma vez no verão quente de 2019. A história começou na última década do século XX, foi percorrendo diferentes mandatos autárquicos. Começou com um autarca, a polémica começou na década de 90, de 1990, com o autarca socialista, depois exponenciou-se no mandato seguinte de um autarca do PSD, quando teve, por exemplo, a ideia de criar uma marca Oliveira Salazar e com ela fazer produção de vinhos e de chouriços, e a seguir, no verão de 2019, voltou a rebentar uma intensíssima polémica quando o autarca de Santa Comba anunciou que ia avançar com este projeto de criar um centro interpretativo do Estado Novo na aldeia natal, na terra natal de Oliveira Salazar. Vivemos mais uma vez um verão quente, muito parecido em termos académicos com o que o Manuel nos descreveu, enchendo ou dando lugar a uma guerra também de petições a favor, contra. Chegou a haver o absurdo de existir uma petição para clonar Oliveira Salazar, não é? Além das petições a favor e a contra Oliveira, a Constituição do Museu, muitas outras se multiplicaram. Quais são as conclusões que nós retiramos ao analisar a forma como têm sido levadas a cabo as celebrações do 25 de Abril e como a memória histórica é debatida na praça pública, no espaço público e na comunicação social em Portugal? Nós podemos nos questionar se estes episódios são ou não importantes. E a conclusão que eu penso a que todos chegaremos, e se alguém estiver contra poderemos debatê-lo, é que na construção da memória histórica é muito importante ver a frequência e a forma como certos temas, nomeadamente estes que eu referi, entram no debate público. Qual a frequência e a forma como eles entram nesse debate público e se eles são ou não ativados politicamente. E por isso, como eu dizia desde o início, eu tenho muitas dúvidas que essa imagem que nós sucessivamente transmitimos de que Portugal é um país reconciliado com o seu passado é uma ideia errónea. Porque, na prática, nós debatemos muito pouco estas questões da história, da memória e das políticas do passado. Elas têm, de facto, uma fraquíssima presença na agenda política e no debate público. Temos casos pontuais em que há estas erupções de memória e de debate histórico, mas em todo este processo nós rapidamente percebemos que problemas não são os únicos, mas problemas como o facto de haver pelo menos uma dupla identidade, se assim podemos chamar, em muitos historiadores, que são académicos, mas são também políticos, ou são também comentadores políticos. E, portanto, torna-se, e estes casos são emblemáticos a esse respeito, ter um debate imparcial, académico e, sobretudo, que informe e que esclareça sobre aquilo que está em causa nestes debates. Porque cada vez mais o que nós vemos a analisar estes episódios que eu vos referi é que a dinâmica ou as dinâmicas do presente suplantam rapidamente os legados do passado. E neste processo, aspectos que é fundamentais na história e na chamada história pública, que é o papel da história na construção e na consolidação da ordem democrática. Obrigada.
Só por curiosidade, o museu foi para a frente ou não?
Não,
Não foi.
não foi.
Não se concluiu.
Não se concluiu.
Pronto. Voltando à nossa ordem inicial, portanto, vamos às perguntas escritas. Eu acho que o Paul, tu tens uma pergunta. You have a question, Paul.
How to deal with the 35.5%? Okay, well, first, my congratulations to Dr. Inácia for an excellent presentation, which is very deep and gives us a lot to think about. As someone who studies April 25th, I always learn from her, so thank you, extraordinary. Actually, my comments on 37.5 relate to the Verão Quente of 2019. I think it's very important, and perhaps the Museu Salazar is not the right way to do it because of the polemic that it involves. But the conservation of memory is essential for this conversation to continue. Both the mistakes and the correct decisions. It's part of the story. And if you don't have that story, if you don't tell the story in a correct way, people will begin to lose interest altogether. And we'll be simply left with the activists that have a strong point of view, but that becomes more and more and more narrow. And so for me, the question, the question about this is that 37.5%. That's the question. I talked about path dependence and I explained how it worked out, but that implies something deeper and perhaps more significant, which is collective shared experience. That shared experience, the good and the bad. Every family has mistakes. Every family has dirty laundry. Every family has triumphs, but it needs to be told, it needs to be understood in a profound way. So if a specific museum is somehow triggering a reaction, then fine, have something different. My colleagues in Coimbra at the 25th of April Documentation Center have a marvelous documentary evidence, and they've collected, and they go to schools, and they have plenty of material on Salazar, they have plenty of material on the revolution, they have all of it. So I think it's very important for the story to be told in an open manner. The problem if you say no to a museum is that you deny something that happened. And so honestly, let's go back to our presentation, the combination from the diaspora and from within Portugal. If we say no museum, no fascism, oh, terrible, then what's the point of April 25th? Why should it happen? What's the consequence? Why is it important? Doesn't matter. Well, we're not fascists. So since the reason why April 25th happened is because fascism happened, because they're the diaspora, because they're spending all this time stockpiling gold and fighting colonial wars. And the only traveling my family did before this was to go to Mozambique and Angola to fight wars. That's the only travel they got. At least it was paid for. That was the only travel they got. Come to America, to go to Brazil. This was to escape. To go to France, that was to escape because of the dictator. So it needs to be understood why it was there. And by the way, 48 years is something of a collective memory. On balance, it was horrific, insult to our humanity. But there were certain elements of it that provided stability that allowed it to continue. And that speaks maybe to the Portuguese character, maybe some of the policy, something. So it's worth the conversation. And if the conversation is, we're not going to have the conversation because if you have it, you're a fascist and you're against humanity. Well, that's not a way to get to that 37.5%. So I'm suggesting an engaged dialogue around collective memory in which information is shared in an intelligent way. And exactly what my colleagues at University of Coimbra do, they have fairs, they go to schools and they teach and they present the documentary evidence in a free and open way. I don't know the background between those who wanted the museum. If it's a group from Chega, then you're going to get a reaction. If it's a group of academics, you're going to get another reaction. So if it's political, that's what I'm suggesting, you're going to get a certain polemic. If it's academic, where it should be, I think it's something, and that would help us. So in other words, you have to, I really think the issue for Portugal now is at 37.5%. And so that story has to be told, because otherwise, honestly, all the great things that happened, the bravery, the courage, and I can speak about it because when I looked into their eyes, when I sat with Othello, which was the most amazing 4 hours of my life, and eye to eye, he was open. He was out of prison. He went back and forth in those days, but he was eye to eye, telling me what happened, telling him what he was afraid of, telling me why he shut off the borders with Spain that night, April 24th, going to 25th. Because he was afraid that Franco was going to invade. Talking about the challenges to take over all the antennas and TV and all the broadcasts, the Granola Vila Morena, and where that sign, all of that passion and intelligence and strategy was to stop fascism. And if we don't understand our history, we won't appreciate the great gifts. We're all flawed, they're good and bad, but that was a great moment and something to be celebrated. But we only can do that if we appreciate the bad of our memory. So that would be a way of approaching it.
Thank you, Paul, very much. You have both questions, so please have a look.
I think the impact on Chega for the 50th anniversary is something that Dr. Inácia should talk about.
Eu não tenho uma reflexão desenvolvida sobre esse assunto, mas o que ficou mais uma vez evidente na intervenção que fizeram hoje na Assembleia da República é que é um diálogo de surdos. Não há qualquer possibilidade de ter um debate sereno, como o Paulo sugeria, informado, que esclareça, sem impor posições político-ideológicas a quem escuta, com o discurso que foi introduzido, que tem sido introduzido desde que o Chega está na nossa vida política e na nossa vida pública. E, portanto, é de facto uma dificuldade e não me parece que o interesse, e pela postura que tem manifestado, que o interesse seja discutir, esclarecer, informar e aprender sobre o que afinal aconteceu, de todos os lados, de todas as posições, de todas as propostas. A postura é de, mais uma vez, terra queimada, da boa rasa e de imposição de uma cartilha única sobre o que devemos pensar, o que devemos recordar e o que a história deve apresentar como sendo uma visão do nosso passado.
Do you want to add something, Paul?
No, I agree 100%. And it's it's always a challenge for historians and political scientists, so those who study history, to try to speak about it in a way that's detached from the current moment. Chega has its own foundations, its own ideology, its own interest. And some could say it's in a reaction to some elements of April 25th and a recovery of some sort of illusions of what happened prior in some sense. And so there's always that, but that's a separate conversation. It's a political conversation. Maybe something about, you see this throughout Europe, even in France, 41% goes to Le Pen. You see a reaction against the European Union, maybe an exhaustion with the European project. We see a lot of things happening like that. But our job is, as educators, is to educate. And education implies having an open conversation and in an honest way and not hiding history, but presenting it in all its glory or all its sin. So my job is not a political one, it's an education one. And so that's why I'm in favor of maybe not that museum in its precise form, but a place where all that information is documented and people can learn from it.
You have another question. I would like you to read it and tell me, what do you think we can learn today from the Portuguese Carnation Revolution, which was essentially peaceful? Are there lessons that can be applied in a world that is faced with increasing levels of violence and populism? Have a go.
Gracias.
Okay.
Sorry, I was reading the other one afterwards. Sorry,
Sorry.
I didn't hear you. I think it's this one for you, please, Paul. Go ahead.
So I think how unique the Carnation Museum Revolution was, that the amount of bloodshed was at a minimum. In a sense, we could see that the old order was exhausted, and so it fell without a fight. But how do we reflect on it? We look at we look what's happening in Ukraine. We look at the violence that's taking place in different places. We see that violence is so frequently how regimes change takes place. So the singularity and uniqueness of what happened in Portugal, I think, is something about the Portuguese character. It's something that sociologists and cultural people, academics need to look at, but in a certain sense, a model for peaceful change. This was a theme that I dealt with quite a bit in my interviews. Each and every one of the captains that I talked to, I asked, why didn't you get into a fight? Why no civil war? Otello, why no civil war on April 25th? Jaime Neves, why no civil war on April 25th? Ian, Spinola, all of them, why no civil war? And to a person, they each said, we did this to make Portugal a better place, not to kill our brothers. So even with their ideological differences, and they were deep, and even though they had deep and passionate arguments, they still viewed each other as Portuguese and as brothers, and they chose not to kill each other. That had to be one of the factors, at least that's the factor that I took away from what they told me. It was 15 years later, but everyone said it. I found that remarkable. Is that unique to Portugal, or is that a lesson that can be shared? I don't know. But Portugal, I can say, is very fortunate that it happened that way.
Is there any other question of our auditorium that would like
I think there's another one. Yes, there's one for Dr. Maria Inácia.
Mas não me parece que este é o âmbito para conversar sobre estes temas. Peço muito desculpa, eu não vou opinar sobre o professor Pedro Adão e Silva, nem sobre as funções que acabei de assumir, como imaginam.
Tá bem.
Ah, não tinha visto.
Tá bem.
Ok, claro. Outra, another one. No, I think this is a comment more than a question. O Chega é uma realidade relativamente à qual é necessário estar atento.
Yes.
Okay, the comment.
Yes. And in my world, it's something we just look at, because we usually do 2020. That's why it's easier. We make assessments after it happens. So we try to make sense of the world, as opposed to predict what's going to happen. Commentators of a soccer match.
Any other question? No more? Well, if there is no other question, I think it's time to finish our commemoration of the 25th of April, which was, for me, it was fantastic. And to have the opportunity to meet doutora Maria Inácia Rezola, foi fantástico o seu contacto e a sua presença. E Paul, contigo estamos sempre em contacto. Foi uma forma diferente de estarmos a conversar. Normalmente não é assim tão... Não versa estas matérias, muitas outras, mas esta também. E acho que era o momento de partilhares com o nosso auditório a tua visão sobre o 25 de Abril e tendo o contraponto da doutora Maria Inácia Rezola. Resta-me agradecer, não sei se algum dos elementos da Sedes de Leiria quer também dar alguma nota da sua...
Eu posso só dizer uma coisa final, é que se tudo correr bem, no próximo ano o livro do Pelo vai ser integralmente traduzido para português e publicado em Portugal. E, portanto, acho que será uma excelente oportunidade para todos terem acesso ao trabalho fantástico que ele fez e as entrevistas que são peças únicas. E, portanto, esperemos que tudo chegue a bom porto, não é, Pelo? As coisas avançam.
Não, que são peças únicas, já não é possível voltar a pôr, é impossível, não é? Impossível. Nádia, não sei se queres dizer alguma coisa para finalizar. A Nádia é a nossa presidente da Sedes.
Só agradecer ao Paul e à Maria Inácia por estarem presentes. Muito obrigada. Eu penso que é um desafio, sobretudo para a Maria Inácia agora, esses próximos 2 anos. Desejamos muito boa sorte. Acho que esses 37% são desafiadores e às vezes eu me pergunto no meio, às vezes 5% de pessoas muito focadas, ainda que muito mal focadas, podem levar uma massa de pessoas que estão um pouco assim a leste, que andam ao sabor da onda, acham que está tudo garantido, que a liberdade está garantida, que os direitos, os princípios, os valores estão garantidos. Nós precisamos de uma porcentagem muito pequena de pessoas com princípios muito contrários aos nossos e aquilo que a democracia precisa e é saudável. E às vezes eu me pergunto se esses 5% não estejamos a chegar lá. E agora com as eleições em França e com aquilo que se está a passar em tantos lados aqui na Europa, isso preocupa-me muito. E boa sorte. Eu acho que há aqui um grande trabalho de pedagogia a fazer. Boa sorte. Uma oportunidade.
Obrigada.
Nada. Paul, muito obrigada, Paul.
Nada, claro.
E Nádia, só para terminar, também é esse o nosso trabalho da Sedes, também é o debate de ideias e é disponibilizar, neste caso através de uma plataforma, porque permite estar com o Paul nos Estados Unidos e estar com a Maria Inácia em Lisboa e eu estou aqui em Porto de Mós e outros estão em Évora. Temos aqui pessoas que são de Évora, da sede distrital de Évora, portanto, estás a ver, temos aqui um núcleo...
Já agora Coimbra também.
Coimbra, portanto temos aqui um ciclo de gente e de pessoas que podem fazer a diferença, podem de facto criar um espaço de debate de ideias e que depois podem ser aproveitadas ou não. É esse o nosso trabalho, é levantar questões, levantar problemas e levantar outras apreciações e outros ângulos de visão do mesmo problema. Foi isso que nós quisemos trazer hoje com a nossa comemoração diferente do 25 de Abril. Paulo, não sei se tu também queres dizer alguma coisa. Paulo Carreira da Silva. Paulo?
Não. Acho que já está tudo dito. Fiquei surpreendido pela conversa e pelo debate de ambos, tanto do Polo como da professora Maria Inácia Rezola, que não conhecia o seu trabalho, só agora recentemente é que tomei conhecimento com este convite. E de facto estamos bem entregues, professora, estamos bem entregues na comemoração do 25 de Abril.
E vamos conversar consigo. Este foi só o primeiro encontro.
E o Polo já não o via há 40 anos. Eu acompanhei o Polo nas suas deslocações a Porto de Mós e nestas entrevistas. Éramos muito mais novos.
Lembro-me bem.
Era
ontem, Paulo.
Era ontem. E estávamos nós longe de perceber que, de facto, isso iria dar um livro e que
verdade.
ia ter um documento
e um debate hoje.
na nossa história.
Mas foi uma boa notícia.
E tua irmã era muito amiga da Ana também.
Exatamente.
Ainda somos. Ainda mantemos essa amizade. Olha, obrigada a todos pela vossa presença, disponibilidade. Foi uma forma diferente de terminarmos o 25 de Abril. Eu não resisti, trago aqui os meus cravos que vieram diretamente da Assembleia para aqui. Muito obrigada. Até uma próxima. Obrigada. Adeus. Boa noite.
Boa noite.
Boa noite e parabéns.
Boa noite.
Obrigada.
Boa noite.
Parabéns à Sedes.
Boa noite, beijinho, Paulo, beijinho.
Obrigado. Boa noite.
Obrigada a todos. E vamos estar em contacto com a doutora Maria Inácia. Obrigada.